1973 was a great year for me. I graduated from college. I got my first job. I celebrated my first wedding anniversary. Great year. We think of it as, you know, not too bad at the time. The Vietnam War was winding down. But two things happened that year that affect our lives today. You probably know one of them, and I'll tell you the other one. What?
Gas crisis.
Well, we had that too. Roe v. Wade in January of that year. And the second thing is that the American Psychiatric Association declassified homosexuality as a deviant behavior. 1973. Now, charismatic renewal was going great. We were having Jesus festivals back then. Remember all that kind of stuff? The Jesus movement was bringing in thousands of kids. It was a wonderful time, yet these two very serious things happened in that time. Now, in the last couple of years, I've had occasion to meet with some pastors of large churches, one of them in Seoul, Korea, and the other in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And it's a very quiet group. It doesn't even have a name. It doesn't have a website. It was about 30 pastors of mega churches from third world countries. And to be invited to the group, your church had to be 20,000 members. And it was how could they network and encourage each other and discuss problems and things like that. And what they did was they invited some ministry leaders to come in. So they invited Mike Bickle. He actually is the one that got me invited. They had a Campus Crusade and different ones. We met with these pastors. The first meeting was the same spring as the Arab Spring. Remember that in Egypt? In fact, one of the pastors there, his church was not 20,000. They made a few exceptions in countries where they didn't have it. Like there's no church in Europe that big. So the guy from Germany only had 4,000. But this man in Cairo, Egypt, has about 3,000 or 4,000 in his church, right on that square, you know, where all that happened. I mean, we were getting up-to-date reports of what was going on. But the thing that struck me was these pastors were from places like Colombia. You ever heard of what's happening in Colombia?
Persecution.
From places in Africa. And, but they were getting hundreds and thousands of people saved. Their churches were thriving. They were concerned about the problems. In fact, one of the problems they discussed the most was the threat of Islam. But they didn't feel like the world was going down the toilet because the wrong person was the head of their country. Because they had horrible governments to start with. You know, if it wasn't this dictator, it was another dictator. You know what I'm saying? And it was just interesting for me to sit there and sort of think about the fact that the church didn't depend on who was in Washington. But we kind of think that, don't we?
Absolutely.
Now, I live in Florida, where our vote counts and counts. Remember? Okay. Remember the 2000 election? And, you know, we wrote a book called The Faith of George Bush. I believe that he is really saved and really, in his own way, a man of God. You know, I'm glad he won. But I don't know that he moved the needle too much. You know, having a Bible-believing Christian didn't seem to move the needle that much. So I think that we have to get away from the mindset that happens so much that we've got to elect the right person. You know, our country's been divided for a long time. It's just that lately, with the current administration, the tipping point has gotten, and the people that have always been there have just gotten so much more voice and vile and things that we thought that we could ignore because it didn't affect us in our little world. We can't ignore it anymore. But God is still on the throne. Do you believe that?
Yes.
And God has always had his people. So we have to decide what we're going to do. And one thing I think we need to do is we need to start working together. Woo! Because Christians won't work with someone. I mean, I am not real involved in the political process, but I'm somewhat involved and have been in the election of some people that I knew were godly and I really wanted them to get in. And I'll tell you a couple of stories in a minute. One of them is about Mike Huckabee. Now, I couldn't tell you today who the governor is in Arkansas. I paid no attention to Arkansas politics other than Clint was from there. But I heard James Robinson tell about this guy from Arkansas. It's kind of funny, named Huckabee. And as I got to know him, I was very impressed. You know, here was a man who is a rock solid. He loves Jesus as much as anybody in this room. You know, this is not a facade to him. He is a very, very skillful politician, and he can handle the press. I thought I could support somebody like that, you know. And I was one of the first people to get behind him. Now, I didn't really know I was getting behind him, but we put him on the cover of New Man magazine. Now, New Man magazine was a victim of the changes in the publishing industry. We no longer publish it. But we put him on the cover and we said the case for how Mike Huckabee could be president of the United States, which is a pretty audacious statement. And we had a very skillful guy write it, but he said, is it possible that a governor from Arkansas could be president? You know, I mean, it happened before. I mean, we went right down the line. And Mike Huckabee, you know, the article was written without an interview with him. It was just written from the public record and so on. But people started showing up in Iowa asking him to sign it. And he wrote me the nicest email and credited us with helping him with the Iowa caucus. Because nobody would give him the time of day. And we just made a very strong statement, and the evangelical community in Iowa got behind it. Okay, who else won the Iowa caucus?
Pat Roberts.
Well, that was a couple of decades ago, but in 08, who won? On the Democratic side? Obama.
We're from Iowa.
And so here, Mike Huckabee won, and Obama won. Mike Huckabee was actually ahead of McCain until the South Carolina primary. He came 1 percentage behind, and then by the time the Florida primary came a week or two later, McCain was clearly ahead. How different would things have happened if Mike Huckabee had been elected? Now, he's gone on to Fox. He has an enormous amount of influence, and I think that pretty widely our type of people would think fondly of him. Is that right? You know, we respect him, we've been able to see his character and so forth. But there was a group of kind of, I'm going to call them elitist Christians in Washington who met, and they liked to be power brokers. They wanted the politicians to come to them and get their blessing, and the different politicians would come and meet with them. One of them was Mike Huckabee. And they grilled him and asked him questions, and we need to, our leaders need to be able to handle themselves and handle the questions. I have no criticism. But they asked Mike Huckabee, would he push the button for nuclear war if it was necessary? And he gave an answer that said, yes, he could push it, that it would hurt him. He'd think, you know, he'd pray about it, he'd probably cry over it and all this. And one of these influential leaders said, I cannot support someone who's going to cry when it comes time to push the button. This guy was just a hawk. Is that what we call him? You know, for war.
Yeah.
Now, I personally think that he has the courage that he would do what he had to do. And I understand. But this man opposed him. They wanted to be a power broker. And I've seen this happen again and again. You'll have a Christian running for office, he's an Episcopalian, and he drinks wine, and you're from a church and you think that everyone who drinks wine is going straight to hell. And I'm not going to support somebody who's a wine giver. You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? And so we divide and divide and divide, and people are conservative, and I don't like this guy because he's not conservative enough, and I don't agree with what he says about immigration. You know, there's a whole lot of things that we ought to be able to disagree on in politics.
That's right.
Like immigration, for example.
That's right. That's right.
Okay? I mean, the Catholic Church taking their sort of very, very compassionate thing about helping all these illegals and all that kind of stuff. You know, they have a reason to say that. Other people say you gotta stand there with machine guns and guard the border. You know, I mean, we gotta keep the bad people out, you know what I mean? And we have laws. I understand that. But it is not something for Christians to divide on. And really, even when it comes to the Bible, we have to be careful which scriptures we focus on, because there's a lot of scriptures that actually disagree with each other. You know, there's a scripture that talks about pounding your. You can tell I'm not a theology major, but it's, you know, I remember this from when I used to take theology in university. They pound the swords into. And there's a scripture that says exactly the opposite. And we all believe that the Bible says, you know, in the Old Testament, that those who commit homosexuality will be put to death. But it also says, I read it this week, those who violate the Sabbath should be put to death. And every one of us in this room violated the Sabbath this week, according to Old Testament law, right?
Yes.
Could we sit around the house from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday? That's what honoring the Sabbath is, according to the Mosaic law. And so all I'm trying to do is I'm giving my opinion that sometimes these things are not black and white. And in Christianity, you've got very sincere people trying to do what they want to do, and they think, I've got to plant this in here, and in the process, we're losing the war. We're losing the war. You know, if this wine-drinking Episcopalian that I'm making up, it might be the deciding vote on some important bill, right? So I think that we Christians need to wake up. And I think that a lot of the things that we're going through in our country are making us wake up. And we're finding out that we have to get involved. So, I'm going to talk about being involved. I'm just curious, how many of you here have ever made a political contribution to local, state, Congress, president, I don't care? Okay. That's a pretty good percentage, actually. It looked to me like maybe a quarter or a third, right? Okay, I talked to a politician this week, a God-fearing, tongues-talking, demon-bashing believer who's on the city council of Jacksonville, Florida, which is the largest city in Florida, if you know anything about it. And they have, in Jacksonville, their politics are dirty at a level you wouldn't believe. And she has been very, very strong to keep the gay ordinances out and all this kind of stuff. And the left has targeted her. And they call it the 915 group. There's 9 seats that they're targeting and 15 to get rid of. The election's a year from now. And she was asking for a contribution because, you know, the politicians, they have, at least in our state, they have to report their contributions, and it's public record, and they look and see how much has come in. And do you know what I'm talking about, or is this over your head? So anyway, my wife and I, in the state of Florida, we can get $1,000 each per election. So my wife and I each wrote her a $1,000 check. And I've supported her before. But this is the reason I'm telling you. She told me that the business people are supporting her better than Christians. That Christians who have actually encouraged her on her voting, it's like, oh, somebody else can do it. Now, are we being taped? I guess we are, aren't we? I've been attacked before about what I said. Probably everybody in here has supported a nonprofit ministry or a church. Am I right? And thank God you do. I'm a lifelong tither too. But how much money do we give to ministries who claim they're going to change the world? You know, some of these ministries are huge. I mean, there are several ministries that are very common, they're over $100 million a year. Now that's to do their TV show and their staffs, and in fact, I've had occasion to get to know Governor Huckabee because it was very hard for him to raise money. And I got on the phone and raised $150,000 for him. And I saw how hard it was to raise money. Of course, I just pretended I was selling somebody an ad. The maximum that you could give at the time per couple was $4,300. That's about what an ad in prison costs. So I just said, you know. And but anyway, we talked about it, and the name of an evangelist came up that had a $150 million budget a year. And Huckabee said to me, if I could raise $15 million, I'd be president of the United States. Now, he had, for reasons I don't understand, people did not contribute to him like Mitt Romney and some other people. That's really probably why he lost. Okay, that went way beyond me. I did my part. In fact, the Lord had to show me that I thought, you know, maybe if we can get momentum going, and maybe, you know, of course, I was way out of my league, but it was something I thought I could do. So I want to challenge you not just to contribute, but also to campaign. But you've got these conservative people that share our values. The left is targeting them. They're going after them. You can Google it. It's been written about. This guy Gil, is his name Gil from Colorado? He poured a lot of money. There was an article in Atlantic Magazine, it must have been in maybe 07, or it was right before the 08 election, in which they said that they wanted to eliminate future sanatoriums because Rick Sanatorum was creating a lot of havoc for their agenda in the Senate. Of course, they targeted him and got him out.
That's right.
And these people want support so badly. They would so appreciate if you go door to door and knock on doors, or put yard signs out, or whatever. I think you'd be pleasantly surprised. A lot of you probably have had nothing to do with the political process other than going and voting. In fact, I probably ought to ask, the first thing we should do is register to vote. I'm not going to embarrass. Jerry Falwell used to ask everybody to stand up, and then he'd say, everyone who registered to vote, sit down. So, that's apparently a true story. And it's just, in my opinion, it's just wrong. It's just wrong if you live in this country and pay taxes and you can't bother registering to vote and go vote. It's just wrong. But the political process, it runs on volunteers. And not only that, but you get to know your politician. They're glad you helped them get elected. And guess what? They answer your phone calls. You know, when there's an issue that comes up, you know, it isn't just some letter that goes in or some email. That's a very ineffective way to communicate. That's very easy to ignore. So I hope that I'm helping you think. Am I making anybody think?
Yeah, that's good.
So are we going to sit around and just thump our chests and talk about how bad things are and commiserate with each other and then feel better because we're talking about it, or we're so concerned? Or are we going to actually do something? You know, God can use people. I didn't really intend to be one of Huckabee's first supporters, but I was able to see how much a relatively small amount of support helped him with credibility. Now, I'm also going to tell you a story. I mentioned the election of 2000. Does anybody recognize the name Katherine Harris? Okay, Katherine Harris was Secretary of State in the state of Florida. At the time, Jeb Bush was our governor, and the Secretary of State is the one that's over all the supervisors of election. okay? And I've got to know Catherine Harris. She's actually a spiritual Christian. I don't know if you know that.
Yes.
And she comes from a very influential family, a very wealthy family. And, but what you'll be surprised is that in the 4th grade, she lived in Bartow, Florida. She went to Floral Avenue Elementary. And her 4th grade teacher was Amy Strang. That's my mother. And my mother, when Catherine Harris ran for Secretary of State, my mother, who she lived in some other states when she moved down to Florida, she had said, you know, I had a little girl in my class named Catherine Harris. I wondered if it's the same person. And I said, well, you know, it's about the right age, and it might be, you know. And so, why don't you write her a letter? So she wrote, my mother wrote her a letter, longhand, cursive, like a 4th grade teacher. And she got a phone call from Catherine. Oh, Mrs. Strang. Oh, I remember you. You were my favorite teacher. You know what? This made my mother. My mother's about this tall. You know, she just felt like she was 8 feet tall. Made her feel so good. But this is what Catherine Harris said. In Florida, in the 4th grade, they teach you about civics and state government. And Catherine Harris said that in the 4th grade, she had a desire to someday run for public office because of my mother. Now, my mother is a little Pentecostal lady. Her parents were pioneer Pentecostal preachers. My mother is quiet, a little bit timid, and she is not an activist by any way. She's a prayer warrior. In fact, somebody remarked to me one day that my mother was one of the first prayer warriors she ever saw. And I thought, well, I guess she is. I thought everybody's mother knelt by the bed and prayed for hours. And, you know, this is kind of what I grew up with. But my mother prayed for all her students. So in the 1960s, when she was praying for Catherine Harris, do you believe that God could have used that? So that all these years later, Catherine Harris was in the right position? So now, how do I know that story? Because I'm in that family. If it wasn't for that, I wouldn't know that story. It's not well documented. How many stories like that happen that we never know about? How many people have we influenced that we never find out about? In fact, if my mother hadn't reached out to Catherine Harris, she would have never known. I would have never known. You would have never known. But I'm just saying that there are things you can do. You can pray. Don't we believe in prayer?
Yes.
Don't
we believe that prayer changes things?
Yes.
Now, it's no surprise that this is not the worst time in history. In fact, if you study European history, my people came here for religious freedom, literally. They were French. You know what they did to the French? The Huguenots, the Protestants. At one time, 40% of France was Protestant. Today, there's more Muslims in France than there are Protestants. You either had to go back to the Catholic Church, you had to leave, or they killed you. So my ancestors came to America. And, you know, that's got to be worse than the Obama administration. I mean, you know, at least we have freedom, some freedoms, right?
Yes.
But I want to tell you a story. In fact, I'm going to go back and research this so that I can tell the story better. Has anybody ever heard of Camp Farthest Out? Yes. Yeah, you would. You remember the name Glenn Clark? He was a writer of some note. He died in the 50s, and his stuff is like really good. And we get his books, you know, from the antiquarian book buyers and stuff. Some really good stuff, and I've probably read 5 or 6 of his books. And he wrote about how the Christians prayed during World War II. Okay? Now, World War II, that was a pretty bad time. How many Jews died?
6 million.
We were talking about at dinner what would have happened if Hitler had won?
That's right.
What would life be like if Hitler had won? And we have to thank God that the Allies won. Now, historians don't typically record that evangelical Christians swung the tide of war. But in this book, when I read that, I thought, you know what, there was probably a lot of people praying, right? And God heard their prayers. What about the communism coming down?
Absolutely.
How many people, that was within our lifetime.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You know what, when I used to live in Iowa when I was a kid, and when Khrushchev was in, they'd make us get under the desk. Like, that's gonna help. There's a nuclear war. Did anybody else have to do that?
Yes. We can have it. Yes.
Didn't we think we lived with communism all of our lives? Didn't we? I never thought communism would end. Now it seems almost like a distant memory. It doesn't seem nearly as bad as some of the other stuff I have to put up with. At least the, you know, the Russians didn't want to. They knew if they blew us up, we'd blow them up. You know, I mean, some of these radicals nowadays, the Islamic radicals are insane. You know, I mean, it's a radical fringe, but 19 people brought down the Twin Towers and have created all this havoc ever since. So I'm saying, communism came down. We can document how people prayed, right?
Yeah.